Billions of dollars were actively on the table, yet not a single cent was flowing toward the official association. Major global brands were not merely pursuing Eala, they were making unprecedented moves. Sponsors were actively abandoning the entire established tour. A 19-year-old prodigy from the Philippines had suddenly become far more commercially valuable than a massive, legacy sporting institution. She overshadowed a professional circuit that took over 5 decades to painstakingly build. She achieved this incredible feat not through absolute dominance at major tournaments, nor through holding the highest ranking. Instead, her supremacy came through something far more dangerous to the traditional establishment. She possessed pure, uncontrollable, and undeniable cultural magnetism. When the staggering financial numbers finally started to surface, the global tennis community did not merely raise their eyebrows. The entire sporting world collectively held its breath in sheer disbelief. What was unfolding before their eyes was not just a simple sponsorship story. This was an unprecedented power shift and a quiet corporate revolution. This revolution arrived completely dressed in a traditional tennis skirt, and the governing body never even saw it coming. Stay fully engaged with this story. By the end of this deep dive, you will completely understand why the most important battle in sports right now is not happening on any physical court. There is a very specific, rare kind of athlete. This is the kind of athlete who completely transcends their sport long before the governing body fully recognizes their impact. Muhammad Ali achieved this remarkable feat, and Serena Williams did the exact same thing. Now, regardless of whether the traditional establishment welcomes it or not, Eala is doing it as well. She is operating on a monumental scale that is shaking the foundation of the sport. Her influence has major corporate boardrooms, stretching all the way from Manila to Manhattan, scrambling to completely restructure their fundamental marketing strategies. They are ripping up their old blueprints entirely. She was born in the Philippines, raised on relentless daily discipline, and meticulously shaped by elite tennis academies in Spain. Eala carried something incredibly unique into the realm of professional tennis that absolutely no standard coaching manual could ever teach. She carried a profound and deeply moving cultural story. It was a genuinely cross-continental and multi-generational narrative. This incredible journey deeply resonated with billions of passionate individuals spread across all of Southeast Asia. Her influence bridged Europe and the Americas simultaneously. This rare and powerful combination created the ultimate underdog origin story that the world desperately craved. The unique geography of her roots, paired with an elite training background and a highly infectious personality, created a perfect storm. It was exactly what top-tier marketing executives desired most. Insiders privately describe her rise as a flawless and perfect cultural convergence. Massive global corporations took serious notice long before her official rankings ever caught up to her mainstream fame. By the time she was finally breaking through on the main professional circuit, her dedicated digital presence was undeniable. Her massive social media following had already vastly outpaced dozens of seasoned veterans. She was leaving significantly higher-ranked players completely in the dust. Furthermore, her daily digital engagement rates were not merely strong for a standard tennis player. They were exceptionally strong for absolutely any athlete competing in any sporting discipline anywhere on the entire planet. Global brands began measuring her authentic audience connection rather than basic vanity metrics. They prioritized deep loyalty over empty follower counts, finding actual and measurable emotional investment from deeply rooted communities. They were seeing analytical numbers that were entirely unprecedented in the industry. These staggering figures quite literally made their senior data analysts nervously double-check their own internal datasets. Premium sportswear companies, luxury watchmakers, massive technology giants, and sprawling telecommunications brands awakened. Corporations boasting enormous consumer bases across the globe all took immediate notice of her transcendent appeal. These industry titans were not just mildly interested, they were ready for commercial war. They were actively competing with ruthless aggression to secure her exclusive signature. Behind heavily guarded closed doors, initial conversations were rapidly escalating from basic exploratory discussions directly into serious negotiations. These discussions quickly morphed into massive, long-term financial commitments. Crucially, these high-stakes commercial conversations were not flowing through the standard official league partnership channels. Instead, corporate executives were bypassing the governing body entirely and going directly to her personal representation. This specific structural distinction matters enormously to the future of the sport. The entire professional tour operates on a deeply traditional and highly rigid sports marketing infrastructure. Their system heavily relies upon centralized group sponsorships and collective official partnerships. All of their core revenue structures are explicitly designed around enriching the broader collective rather than the individual. That established commercial model certainly functioned brilliantly for several decades. However, it was fundamentally built for an entirely different era of sports entertainment. It was designed for a time long before a single solitary athlete could command significantly more digital attention. She held more sheer cultural influence than the entire massive organization supposedly promoting her daily matches. Eala ultimately represented something completely unprecedented that the traditional legacy model simply had not prepared for. She embodied a completely unprecedented phenomenon that the traditional commercial model had never properly accounted for. Here was a solitary player whose individual brand gravity was literally pulling massive sponsors completely out of the official tour orbit. She achieved this incredible feat without generating any controversy and without initiating any conflict whatsoever. She did it simply by existing and deeply connecting with massive audiences. She operated on a powerful cultural frequency that the institutional voice of the official governing body simply could never match. Inside elite tennis circles, frantic whispers were rapidly multiplying. Agents representing other highly ranked players suddenly started hearing alarming news from their long-term corporate brand partners. Massive marketing budget allocations were being drastically reassessed. Long-standing tournament sponsors began receiving incredibly quiet and hesitant responses to their standard annual renewal proposals. The massive pool of corporate money was not actually disappearing from professional women tennis. Instead, that tremendous wealth was rapidly concentrating and flowing directly toward one singular and undeniably powerful point of cultural gravity. That specific point of gravity had a very famous name. That specific point of gravity also possessed a devastating backhand that could literally stop entire conversations. The most terrifying part for the establishment was that this phenomenon was only just getting started. Ask yourself this deeply profound question right now. When was the absolute last time a mere teenager forced billion-dollar global corporations to completely rethink their entire sports marketing strategy? Because that exact unprecedented moment had already definitively arrived. Massive financial numbers always have an incredibly stubborn way of escaping private corporate boardrooms. Those highly sensitive figures were absolutely never meant to leave those highly secure rooms. The unprecedented figures being actively discussed in private corporate negotiations surrounding her individual sponsorship portfolio were mind-boggling. These were absolutely not your standard, modest endorsement deals. These were definitely not the typical mid-tier commercial arrangements that professional tennis players ranked outside the top 10 usually secure. What was secretly circulating inside, highly confidential term sheets and preliminary corporate agreements, represented an entirely new category. It was an unprecedented level of long-term financial commitment. These staggering numbers placed this rising young player, who was still actively climbing the professional rankings, into elite commercial conversations. She was dominating financial discussions, usually reserved exclusively for established, multiple-time Grand Slam champions. Highly credible reports, rapidly emerging from elite sports business circles, indicated a massive shift. They detailed incredible individual brand offers approaching astronomical financial figures. When these massive individual offers were combined across her multiple exclusive corporate partnerships, they created a truly staggering total portfolio value. This unprecedented commercial value was being measured not in mere millions. Instead, her total commercial value was actively being measured in the billions of dollars when projected across multiple massive multi-year corporate commitments. This was a completely unprecedented financial reality. A massive global telecommunications giant, boasting enormous market penetration throughout all of Southeast Asia, was reportedly among the aggressive frontrunners. They desperately wanted her exclusive signature. Several massive global sportswear corporations deeply understood the profound cultural footprint she uniquely commanded. She held sway across an enormous and rapidly expanding young global consumer demographic. These powerful apparel titans eagerly entered into incredibly serious and highly lucrative long-term financial discussions. Major global technology brands, desperately seeking authentic ambassador voices, fully agreed. They universally viewed her as a completely irreplaceable cultural asset in vital emerging global markets. What made these massive corporate offers truly extraordinary was a fascinating commercial detail. The truly remarkable aspect was not purely the massive financial scale, but rather the highly unprecedented structural design. Major corporate brands were absolutely not approaching her management team with standard requests. They were no longer asking how she might neatly fit into the existing, highly rigid official tour partnership frameworks. Instead, they were eagerly constructing entirely custom, highly lucrative, and wildly creative commercial arrangements. They pitched exclusive long-term collaborations, highly lucrative corporate ownership stakes, and completely customized branded content ventures. They built massive, long-term global ambassador architectures. These innovative commercial structures treated her entirely as a powerful standalone media entity, rather than simply treating her as a standard, easily replaceable professional athlete endorser. One highly respected sports marketing analyst recently spoke to leading global industry publications about this phenomenon. They described this completely unprecedented commercial situation with incredibly striking directness. Massive global corporate brands had essentially reached a very firm and highly calculated financial conclusion. The profound and powerful emotional connection that her authentic personal brand generated was undeniable. They realized that this massive, highly engaged global audience was far more efficiently accessed by going directly around the official professional tour rather than paying to go through it. The official and highly traditional professional partnership infrastructure certainly remained somewhat valuable for broadly reaching standard, older legacy tennis audiences. However, it completely failed to deliver something else. The rigid legacy system simply could not deliver the incredibly specific, intensely loyal, and highly culturally relevant young global communities that passionately followed her personal journey. For the official governing body of women tennis, this harsh new reality carried incredibly severe financial implications. When massive global corporations actively redirect their vital sponsorship capital completely away from traditional organizational partnerships, they funnel those funds toward individual athlete deals, located entirely outside official tour structures. Consequently, the broader collective severely loses its vital negotiating leverage, causing other players to lose crucial visibility and smaller regional tournaments to lose essential funding pipelines. The entire sporting ecosystem undeniably feels the crushing financial pressure, and here is the fascinating dimension that truly sharpened the underlying tension of this entire saga. The young prodigy was absolutely not intentionally engineering this unprecedented situation, nor was she aggressively positioning herself in an adversarial manner against any legacy institution. Her elite representation was quite simply reacting to a truly extraordinary level of global market demand with a perfectly appropriate and highly sophisticated commercial strategy. That strategic approach is absolutely not an act of rebellion, but rather brilliant global business. However, the severe consequences for the governing body remained completely identical regardless of her pure intent, leading to deeply uncomfortable internal conversations behind heavily guarded closed doors. Highly stressed tour executives desperately wondered how a legacy organization could possibly retain its crucial sponsorship relevance when one of its very own members had undeniably become a more attractive individual financial investment than the entire collective platform. They struggled to comprehend exactly how to fundamentally restructure rigid commercial frameworks originally built for a prehistoric, pre-social media landscape. They needed to figure out how to successfully accommodate a singular transcendent athlete whose deeply loyal personal digital audience absolutely dwarfed their own sprawling institutional reach. These massive structural dilemmas were undeniably no longer merely hypothetical strategic questions debated in corporate boardrooms, as they required absolutely immediate and highly decisive answers. The governing body seemed to be searching for those critical existential answers far too slowly, for a variety of complex reasons that would very soon become incredibly public. The billion-dollar question consuming the industry was certainly not whether the young phenom actually deserved these unprecedented financial offers, because absolutely nobody seriously disputed her immense cultural value. The fundamental question currently tearing through elite tennis boardrooms was far more deeply unsettling, as executives aggressively debated whether the official tour had already completely lost control of the global commercial narrative. If they truly had lost their grip, experts fiercely debated whether they could ever possibly reclaim that ultimate authority, because complete and utter silence during moments of profound institutional crisis is absolutely never truly silent. It loudly communicates absolutely everything you need to know about an organization in panic. While high-stakes brand negotiations aggressively surrounding the teenage prodigy were rapidly intensifying, and while astute sports business media outlets were successfully beginning to connect the dots publicly, the official communication channels remained conspicuously and deafeningly quiet. There was absolutely no formal public acknowledgement, nor was there any sign of a clear strategic positioning statement or proactive effort whatsoever to intelligently reframe the shifting commercial conversation purely on their own favorable terms. There was merely absolute institutional stillness at precisely the exact pivotal moment when highly decisive and incredibly bold leadership action was most desperately required, and that deafening stillness proved catastrophic. In the chaotic and hyper-connected modern media environment, a massive organization completely failing to aggressively control its own public narrative does not simply create an empty vacuum. Instead, it immediately and recklessly hands the most powerful microphone in the room completely over to absolutely everyone else. Astute tennis journalists, brilliant sports marketing analysts, and highly passionate fan communities spanning across multiple continents all aggressively rushed in to dominate the critical interpretive space that the tour foolishly left wide open. Fiercely competing rival sports entities eagerly joined the frenzy, and the overarching public narrative actively being constructed in their glaring absence was absolutely not flattering in the slightest. It painted a devastatingly accurate portrait of a legacy governing body caught completely unprepared by a massive cultural shift that, when looking backward through the lens of history, had been glaringly obvious and highly visible for several consecutive years. The underlying internal structural reasons for this remarkably delayed institutional response were undeniably vast and deeply complex, largely because the massive organization operates across countless separate global legal jurisdictions. They are constantly forced to simultaneously balance intensely competing internal interests from hundreds of individual players, massive tournament organizers, sprawling global television broadcasters, and deeply entrenched legacy corporate partners. Executive decision-making within that highly convoluted and heavily bureaucratized framework inherently moves at a remarkably deliberate and agonizingly slow pace. In perfectly normal, stable circumstances, that careful deliberateness strongly reflects highly responsible corporate governance. But the utterly unprecedented circumstances actively surrounding her explosive global commercial ascension were absolutely anything but remotely normal. Pure, unadulterated speed was absolutely essential, and rapid institutional adaptation was incredibly urgent, yet that necessary speed was simply not arriving. while massive individual corporate sponsors grew increasingly highly skeptical. Corporate partners began asking if those vital audiences had already migrated, actively choosing to follow specific individual athletes, highly compelling personal stories, and powerful cultural moments instead. They wondered if their target demographics had moved completely away from rigid institutional channels entirely. And the harsh internal answers those massive global brands were receiving proved deeply concerning. These undeniable truths were incredibly uncomfortable for official tour leadership, primarily because cold digital analytics absolutely do not negotiate, and raw audience migration data holds zero respect for history. That harsh digital data completely disregards long-standing legacy partnerships, leading multiple independent commercial assessments to reach an overwhelmingly definitive and unavoidable conclusion. The findings were entirely consistent, proving that the official governing body had measurably weakened in its fundamental ability to reliably deliver highly targeted and immensely valuable audience segments. While the young prodigy saw her individual digital platforms simultaneously strengthen to unprecedented levels, other players actively competing across the professional tour rapidly began noticing the devastating downstream effects. Their crucial private conversations with potential personal sponsors were noticeably shifting in a negative direction, creating severe anxiety among the broader collective of professional athletes. Corporate brand representatives who previously viewed an official tour partnership alignment as a highly positive signal were suddenly mentioning that connection far less frequently in preliminary negotiations. They began aggressively framing those institutional connections with severe commercial qualifications that had absolutely never appeared before in standard contract discussions. The once mighty institutional endorsement that historically amplified an individual player and boosted her commercial value was undeniably losing a massive portion of its established gravitational pull. Highly respected veteran players speaking strictly anonymously to prominent sports journalists began expressing deep and highly genuine frustration regarding this escalating commercial crisis. They had heavily invested their entire professional careers into painstakingly building the collective commercial reputation of the official global tour over countless grueling seasons. The terrifying idea that pure institutional silence during such a pivotal transition moment was potentially undoing decades of massive collective effort felt like a truly profound failure of leadership. Yet, the official channels still provided absolutely nothing, proving that this massive communication vacuum was definitely not just a simple, easily forgivable public relations misstep. It served as a glaring warning signal to absolutely every major corporate partner currently evaluating their long-term financial relationship with professional women tennis globally. This overwhelming silence heavily implied that the massive organization completely lacked either the self-awareness or the basic executive decisiveness required to successfully navigate its own internal transformation. For massive global sponsors who were highly accustomed to exclusively partnering with incredibly forward-thinking and strategically articulate organizations, that silent signal carried tremendously serious weight. Every single passing day of institutional quiet cost the broader collective something incredibly real, and the massive financial invoice was accumulating at a truly terrifying and rapid pace. When massive global corporations actively begin quietly restructuring their massive financial commitments, the specific word they choose to use internally is absolutely never outright withdrawal. The chosen corporate language is always significantly softer, utilizing clever buzzwords like strategic reallocation, portfolio reassessment, or fundamentally shifting core investment priorities. However, operating just beneath that incredibly careful and highly calculated corporate vocabulary, the actual underlying meaning remains completely and undeniably identical in every boardroom. The money was aggressively moving, and within the global ecosystem of women tennis, it suddenly started moving away from the establishment with truly alarming and unprecedented velocity. These massive corporate departures absolutely did not announce themselves in a highly dramatic or public fashion, because that is never how true institutional sponsorship erosion actually operates. The brutal financial bleed happens quietly through standard annual renewal conversations that mysteriously fail to reach proper conclusions, or through lucrative option clauses that silently expire without activation. It occurs through massive legacy partnership agreements that simply are not officially extended with the same aggressive enthusiasm or at the massive financial levels they previously commanded. It happened gradually at first, but then incredibly suddenly, the once sturdy and highly reliable commercial foundation of the entire global tour began showing massive, highly visible structural fractures. Multiple massive global brands, boasting a long-established official tour presence, aggressively began redirecting highly meaningful portions of their annual sports marketing budgets completely elsewhere. They aggressively funneled that capital directly toward highly lucrative individual athlete partnerships that existed completely outside of the standard, rigid official tour structures. The underlying financial calculus directly driving these massive corporate decisions was incredibly straightforward, and from a purely cold commercial perspective, it was entirely and completely rational. Digital audience engagement metrics surrounding specific elite players, with the young prodigy serving as the most dramatic and undeniable example, consistently and vastly outperformed all official tour-wide placement data. For massive corporate brands, relentlessly optimizing every single marketing dollar against actual measurable audience response, the final conclusion was absolutely not complicated. The broader professional tournament ecosystem unfortunately felt this harsh and sudden financial reality almost immediately. Smaller regional tour events, which fundamentally depend disproportionately on crucial sponsorship revenue relative to standard broadcast income, suffered the most. These vital developmental tournaments aggressively began operating under significantly tighter and far more stressful daily financial constraints. Standard annual prize fund discussions suddenly became significantly more complicated and highly contentious among organizers. The massive operational infrastructure that actively supports hundreds of grinding professional players across the sprawling global circuit truly began feeling the severe strain. These were the incredibly hard-working, lower-ranked athletes who would absolutely never command those massive individual billion-dollar portfolios. However, these exact players fundamentally formed the essential competitive backbone that actually made elite professional tennis physically possible. This massive, invisible supporting cast suddenly started feeling highly genuine and truly terrifying daily economic pressure. This crucial and heartbreaking dimension of the massive commercial fallout rarely received any prominent mainstream media coverage whatsoever. The dominant global headline narrative remained focused almost entirely on the teenage prodigy and her truly extraordinary global commercial ascent. The significantly quieter and ultimately far more consequential story was exactly what her massive gravitational commercial pull was actively costing absolutely everyone else. It was silently devastating the specific journeywoman players who would absolutely never benefit from her massive stardom directly in any capacity. A standard, hard-working, mid-ranked professional aggressively competing in the gritty second tier of standard tour events gains absolutely nothing from this shift. She gains zero direct financial benefit from those massive, completely unprecedented individual corporate sponsorship negotiations happening in closed boardrooms. However, she undeniably loses something massive if those aggressive corporate negotiations directly redirect vital funding completely away from the broader collective. She deeply suffers when that essential capital is aggressively pulled away from the core collective infrastructure actively supporting her own grueling professional career. Several highly prominent and widely respected veteran voices buried within the global tennis community aggressively began raising this exact, nuanced point publicly. The sprawling public conversation was absolutely not framed antagonistically toward the young teenage prodigy on any sort of personal level. Virtually every single intelligent global observer openly acknowledged that this massive, industry-shaking commercial situation was absolutely not her direct creation. Nor was managing this massive global economic shift her fundamental personal responsibility or burden to carry in any way. The deep, simmering professional frustration was instead aggressively directed at the glaring structural inadequacies buried deep within the standard sports commercial architecture. It was also firmly directed at a legacy organizational leadership team, widely perceived by insiders as being vastly under-equipped to successfully adapt. Leading global sports economists who were actively studying this massive ongoing situation quickly noted a deeply concerning and highly accurate historical parallel. They clearly saw massive underlying financial dynamics that had previously and completely destabilized several other major professional sports leagues globally. When one solitary individual athlete and their massive commercial value dramatically outpaces standard institutional brand equity, the fundamental financial math permanently breaks. The vital and incredibly necessary revenue distribution strictly hidden within the actual sport immediately becomes fundamentally and permanently imbalanced. The absolute elite, transcendent athletes boasting massive individual digital profiles, successfully capture almost all of the enormous total financial value. Meanwhile, absolutely everyone else, desperately struggling to survive on the grueling professional tour, faces a terrifying and rapidly increasing daily economic uncertainty. The crucial middle class of the standard competitive field, which remains absolutely essential for any professional sports league, long-term health, slowly becomes financially precarious. For the official governing body, successfully managing this unprecedented and highly volatile dynamic absolutely required incredibly urgent and highly sophisticated structural innovation. The massive legacy organization desperately needed entirely new commercial frameworks, truly capable of successfully acknowledging and fully accommodating extraordinary individual athlete value. They needed to achieve this incredible financial balance while simultaneously preserving highly meaningful and absolutely essential collective revenue streams for the broader tour. Whether that incredibly rare and highly sophisticated executive capacity actually existed within the current organizational leadership was a massive, looming public question. The massive and highly terrifying corporate sponsorship exodus was actively answering that exact critical question incredibly loudly and with devastating clarity. The staggering and unprecedented corporate departures were absolutely never really about the young teenage prodigy herself on any fundamental personal level. They were entirely a brutal corporate verdict on whether the official governing body had actually evolved quickly enough to remain commercially essential. It was a harsh financial judgment regarding their basic survival in a completely transformed and highly digitized modern global media landscape. That specific corporate verdict, at this exact pivotal moment in sporting history, was undeniably cutting, exceptionally harsh, and completely unambiguous to all observers. The brutal court of global public opinion and high-stakes corporate finance had officially delivered its devastating and entirely irreversible final judgment. Now, absolutely every single eye aggressively turned directly toward one specific, highly anticipated media interview. And what happened next was truly shocking. Genuinely, absolutely nobody in the entire global sports media landscape could have ever successfully predicted exactly what was about to unfold on screen. There are rare and incredibly defining moments in professional sports when a young athlete says something so unbelievably precise and exceptionally honest. It violently cuts through absolutely every single dense layer of heavily manufactured institutional narrative and lands directly in the global public consciousness. It lands with the exact same devastating precision and undeniable power as a perfectly struck, completely unreturnable winner blasted directly down the tennis line. The brilliant young teenage prodigy calmly and confidently delivered exactly that unprecedented and incredibly powerful cultural moment to the entire waiting world. The massive global internet absolutely did not just react mildly to her incredibly profound words. It quite literally and completely detonated overnight. In a truly historic interview that aggressively circulated across massive global digital platforms with extraordinary and unprecedented viral speed, she brilliantly addressed the commercial situation. She directly addressed the massive global commercial frenzy actively surrounding her young career with a stunning directness that caught virtually every seasoned observer completely off guard. She was absolutely not visibly hostile, nor was she aggressively performing any sort of manufactured public grievance or artificially creating cheap media controversy. Her overall speaking tone was incredibly measured, deeply thoughtful, and remarkably composed in a truly fascinating way that somehow made her carefully chosen words hit infinitely harder. That quiet, deeply authentic composure somehow made her profound public statements resonate significantly more powerfully than absolutely any loud, explosive, emotional outburst ever could have. She eloquently spoke about passionately representing something significantly larger and vastly more important than her own standard individual athletic achievements on the standard professional court. She spoke beautifully about deeply understanding that her massive global digital visibility undeniably carried a massive personal responsibility directly toward her highly devoted communities. She recognized the fierce loyalty of her passionate fans in the Philippines, the broader Southeast Asian community, and millions of young women globally who vividly saw themselves perfectly reflected in her incredible journey. She openly discussed intelligently navigating massive global commercial opportunities in specific ways that properly honored that profound cultural responsibility without ever compromising her core personal values. She firmly asserted that her immense authentic cultural currency rightfully deserved massive global acknowledgement strictly on fair terms that actually reflected modern commercial reality. And then she calmly said something incredibly profound that immediately stopped the entire sprawling global sports media conversation absolutely and completely cold. She openly acknowledged, without a single trace of personal bitterness, but with truly devastating and absolute crystal clarity, a deeply uncomfortable underlying institutional truth. She calmly stated that the incredibly rigid institutional structures currently surrounding professional women's sports had simply never been originally designed with truly transcendent global athletes like her in mind. She represented a new era of athletes whose immense commercial appeal derived strictly from deep cross-cultural resonance rather than relying purely on standard professional ranking achievements. She championed those unique athletes whose deeply personal and highly engaged audience relationships proudly existed entirely independently of any traditional institutional frameworks or official legacy platforms. By simply existing completely authentically, these transcendent athletes aggressively challenged deeply entrenched industry assumptions about exactly how financial value gets officially measured and actively distributed throughout professional sports. Her incredibly profound and deeply resonant words traveled absolutely everywhere simultaneously, as a ravenous global sports media eagerly and aggressively amplified her core message within mere hours. Prestigious marketing industry publications immediately began analyzing her incredibly powerful statements with highly genuine intellectual fascination, while massive fan communities across the globe erupted with fierce national pride. Passionate tennis fans, completely spanning the globe, eagerly engaged in sprawling, highly complex digital debates regarding basic structural fairness, true commercial equity, and desperately needed institutional accountability. What made this specific cultural moment so remarkably powerful was absolutely not any sort of aggressive confrontational quality, but rather the profound and undeniable reasonableness of exactly what she was so eloquently expressing to the world. Absolutely nobody carefully listening could possibly dismiss her incredibly mature perspective as being hopelessly naive or purely self-serving, because her highly accurate structural observations perfectly reflected the exact massive concerns that elite sports economists had been quietly discussing privately for several years. Meanwhile, the official institutional response to this massive cultural landmark was characteristically and agonizingly delayed. eventually arriving strictly as highly defensive and awkwardly positioned corporate deflections that completely failed to engage her profound observations with any real intellectual seriousness. Through all of the massive commercial chaos and intense institutional turbulence actively swirling wildly around her, the 19-year-old phenom remarkably remained entirely composed, deeply gracious, and ruthlessly focused on her ultimate athletic goals. She absolutely never intended to start a massive corporate war with the legacy establishment, but she simply became vastly too large for their archaic legacy structures to comfortably hold, fundamentally shifting the entire financial landscape forever and definitively proving that the sport of professional women tennis will simply never look identical ever again.